Welcome to the Security Get Serious podcast. I'm your host, Ben Carr. I'd like to welcome our guest to episode 2, filmed March 28, 2024, Ryan Permeh. Ryan's been an operating partner at Sin Ventures. He's a board member with several security startups. He's a former co-founder of Cylance, and he's worked with EI, Intel, and been the chief scientist at McAfee. Ryan, thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, it's been great. Let's start off. I have a couple questions. You have a lot of experience in the AI field. I thought it might be good to dive into some things around AI. I'm sure a lot of our listeners have questions about AI and its impact on cyber. So, can you start off and maybe give us some insight into how your journey in pioneering AI-driven security reflects the evolution of the digital threats that we're seeing?
Sure. AI is a powerful technology, and it's one that I've been lucky to have been doing for over 10 years now. With the recent sort of hype around it, it's begun to balloon well past pretty much any expectation. And so beginning to understand sort of what is AI, I think is a good start there. Over the years, AI has been a lot of things to a lot of different people. And we've always kind of looked at AI through the lens of, popular fiction like the Terminator,
sure,
artificial intelligence, elements like that. When we talk about AI, there's this concept of general intelligence that we've been seeking for a really long time, back into the 60s, about having machines that can really think on the same level and of the same caliber or even beyond what a human can. Most AI isn't there yet. Mm-hmm. It's a much more narrow space.
Despite what vendors are telling us,
it's definitely has a lot of hype, and there are a lot of really cool approaches right now that can highlight some elements that resemble the type of intelligence that we're talking about. But yeah, right now we're still pretty far away from all of the logic that a human can put into an equation. Machines aren't quite there yet.
Yeah, so still pretty early in the hype cycle then.
Very, very, very much so.
So when when you think about cyber, are there any insights that you think you can share on specific challenges that you think AI can actually help us with in today's cybersecurity market?
So we have a pretty unique situation in cyber, in that we truly have adversaries, and at its base level, the closest corollary that people have explored with AI is sort of game playing, building strategies where two individuals are adapting their strategies to win. Most AI, from what movie you should watch on Netflix to summarizing an article in the New York Times, doesn't have that concept of adversarial infinite game mechanics where the bad guys and the good guys both exist and they're both responding to the actions of the others.
Would you say that some of that harkens back to like Big Blue and trying to work with some of the like chess theory?
Those were really phenomenal, really early approaches. They were much more computationally intensive. Now,
okay,
don't get me wrong. Some of these large language models, what we call generative AI, are very computationally intensive, but still not on the level of requiring a supercomputer to beat a chess champion.
Yeah, it's almost the democratization of AI, right? I mean, we've really taken it down to a level where it's accessible in somewhat of a real way to the average person right now, with these LLMs.
In the Big Blue case, that was a specific game with a specific set of rules and a specific set of constraints. As you get into these generative AI, the constraints are much broader, and so you're approaching ideas of how people think. We're not quite there yet. Like a lot of the current model of AI is approximating what statistically you would approximate an answer to be. And so at its heart, most AI is just really advanced statistics, the same kind of statistics that we would have had in college, just amped up by multiple millions of times.
So, when I think about AI and the applications that people are trying to use it for, it's interesting that you brought it back to, we're trying to take it in a way that emulates human thought, right? Where it's thinking on its own and it's creating things for us, right? But I think in a way we could all agree that AI has this promise of being this great savior for humanity. That's kind of the larger scope goal. But at the same time, we see a lot of examples and concern around it also being kind of the end of humanity, right? And so if I think about in popular culture how we think about it, you referenced Terminator already. So I think of Terminator, the movie AI, even things like WALL-E, right? Mm-hmm. When I look at AI and that implementation, like it always seems to go horribly wrong in the movies, right? And if I think you referenced it back to this human concept and human thought, once you start thinking about it that way, it brings up this concept of, humans having their own agenda. And does AI have its own agenda? Do you have concerns about that? Like, how well does this end for us?
So, oftentimes when we're talking about AI these days, on one side you have utopians where AI is going to usher in this new era, and on the other side the doomers that it's
Sure.
going to end humanity. I think that's a really important but probably premature conversation.
Why?
I don't think AI is anywhere near the level where it's going to be either of those things.
Okay.
It doesn't mean that we can't get there, but there's been this running theme since the 60s of general artificial intelligence being 10 years out. And through the 60s, they made these promises where we'd have robot butlers, and then the 70s, like it was going to change how we did business. Once we hit the 80s, we hit a concept called the AI winter that kind of rolled back. We realized our compute capabilities were not where they needed to be, and that existed through the 90s into the 2000s. Only once we started getting things like public cloud, big data tools, and the internet, did we have sort of those pieces that we could really start reconsidering artificial intelligence. The same algorithms that we had in the 80s powered the sort of resurgence of AI, and a lot of the things that we're doing now are logical applications from those same things. However, I still think that we're probably at least 10 years, and it wouldn't surprise me if my son or grandson told a similar audience that it was 10 years.
Do you feel that there's any relationship, like based upon Moore's law, to look at actually, like you say 10 years, but then you reference we have this moving 10-year horizon where it keeps moving out. Like, is there any way to actually look at a real predictive model about when we might see that?
So the biggest challenge that we have right now is that we don't understand what human thought truly is.
Okay.
So the predictions on that are always a little bit challenging. We have concepts that you might be familiar with around like the Turing test, but in reality, those are pretty basic. And we've had machine intelligences that can pass Turing tests for a really long time. It doesn't make them intelligent. And right now, I posit that this is sort of a challenging question because we don't need traditionally intelligent or sapient models to achieve great things. Just having a model that's smart enough to solve a problem in an effective, adaptable way generates value. We don't need it to solve all problems or learn to pick up new problems for it to produce value.
So not fully getting to the point where it's a replacement for a human, but getting to the point where it has enough intelligence to be able to solve unique problems.
Right.
Okay.
And even not unique problems. In fact, most of the problems that we face, really we understand the problems. We just don't have great solutions. And being able to reduce that solution space to one that can be adaptable at a non-infinite cost.
Okay. So when we think about these approaches to AI, and as we're developing systems that will be more and more capable, are there specific ethical considerations that we need to take into account that need to be addressed before we deploy these AI models. And I think about things like, the recent concern about LLMs and, the issues that certain companies have had around the release of these models where they've acted in necessarily unintended consequences, right?
So one of the there's two areas here that I kind of want to call out. First is that we should never give an AI more than we would give a human in terms of control. And so even as AIs get better, they're not inherently experts. One of the challenges that we frequently see is that they can say a very smart thing, but they can say it for a very dumb reason. And so I don't want to oversell.
So not much better
concept.
than a person.
Right. Like there's this concept that even if they said a smart thing, that doesn't mean that the next thing that they said will be smart, or that their underpinnings for understanding that are that. Now, there's a secondary part.
Do you relate that back to us putting our own assumptions on those AI models based upon like how we treat each other, right? So if you have this expectation that because it's an artificial intelligent model and it says something smart, that you've essentially reached a goal and it will continue in that direction without the challenge that we present each other every day of like, man, that was really stupid. Why did you say that?
So there's an old saying that artificial intelligence is better than real stupidity. Now, we do attribute some degree of high tech and hype cycle to AI, and it's been able to produce some really interesting results. The challenge, because we're taking a mostly probabilistic approach, is that there's no guarantee, kind of like a financial advisor, past performance does not guarantee future performance. These AIs don't necessarily have, we don't know where their limits are. And we've seen their limits in several scenarios. Things like giving them math word problems. They're not particularly good. They may be pretty good at the nuance of language, but not the underlying components of math. Now, that should be surprising because computers have historically been very good at math. The way that we're approaching the problem allows us to make great strides in one area without necessarily the corresponding spaces on the other. Now, there's another part in terms of regulation and things that we should be really concerned about. When we are taking probabilistic approaches to things, there's a non-zero chance that it can come up with something really, really out there. And so as we start talking about things like autonomous drive, a big part of why that's taking so long is because we still have to get to that spot where we trust that a machine will do better than a human in all the cases, not in this small subset of cases that we've seen, that we want to understand that the logic and reasoning that they're using to build the strategies and outcomes are sound enough that we can support this. And this has a lot of effects in a lot of different situations where knowing that an unconstrained answer could have catastrophic events or consequences, it's going to be, particularly in those regulated industries, significantly hampered because you don't know the specific answer that's going to come out. In terms of driving, in terms of medical, in terms of even some financial, like you're still going to end up with, until you can explain it and you can prove the logic behind it, it's not going to be an acceptable answer.
Yeah, it almost goes back to the kind of first premise of trust but verify, right? Like verifying that the answer you get is actually not just the answer you got, but the answer you're expecting and you should have gotten.
Right. Okay. And one of the things I've seen with AI is that it can produce some really, truly unexpected answers. Now, one of the interesting things is that those unexpected answers could be closer to the truth. And so earlier when you're talking about the mirror, that like AI is a mirror, how we think it's doing is a mirror, finding those objective measures where you can say, this AI said something that shocked me and wasn't what I was expecting, but is it closer to the truth? And being able to to objectively measure that is going to be an important part for us as people interacting with these systems.
So let's dive into that a little bit. So, when you think about a world that's increasingly leveraging on AI, right? That we're building it more and more into our lives. And, if we think 3 years, 5 years out, I can only expect that AI is going to be a lot more a part of our everyday lives than what we do. So given that, and especially as we think about AI in the cyber world or as we leverage it for defense, how do we make sure that we have transparency and accountability into the models we're building around AI, in the algorithm itself?
We, and I'll use it in the security context because it's true in every context, but specifically in the security context, we need to get a lot better with transparency in general. We need to understand what data is going in and what data is coming out, and some explainability on that process. And so I fully expect we're going to see, and we already are, seeing a surge in AI technologies being baked into every element. Some of these are going to produce additional value. Some of them are going to produce a null value. Some of them are going to produce a negative value. I fully expect in a few years we're going to see a bit of a pullback, which is very natural for the hype cycle of diminished returns. Those folks who are spending a significant amount of time understanding the problem and using AI as a tool to help solve that problem, they're the ones that are going to bridge that gap. They're going to be able to show consistent, effective results over a period of time. The ones that can't show effective results are going to be parts of those parts that fall away.
So, we've seen some models and we've seen some results that people have related back to, natural bias that's been inherently in the model based upon the way that humans are inputting data into the models. What do you think about like inherent bias in those models, and how do we look at that? Are we conflating bias with just the way we actually interpret the world, or is there inherent bias that's being imported, and how do we make sure we're filtering out bias ahead?
So this is, I'll give you a very real world example. So before I became a venture capitalist, I was at Silence, and we focus entirely on building models to predict malware.
Yep.
And PDFs at the time were a very important vector of malware. People would send around PDFs. We found, after training our first models, that they were exceptionally effective. And we deployed them to folks in the United States, exceptionally effective. The second that we put them across the border, into Europe, into Asia, their effectiveness dropped off. We didn't choose this, but when we looked at what was good PDF, what was bad PDF, we inherently found that from a U.S. perspective, getting a Chinese PDF or a Russian PDF was an overtly hostile act. Conversely, when you're in Russia, getting a Russian PDF is a very normal activity. And so this concept of bias, it's not like racism type of bias, but it's very easy to forget that your perspective isn't the same perspective as everybody else. And so the way around this, realistically,
and the perspective changes upon the context, right?
100%. And so measuring objectively and holding your assumptions to that objective measure becomes a really important part. And this is part of what we're going to see in those AI systems that succeed versus the one that fail.
It's also interesting you mentioned that, because I think when you look at it with that context, right, that it doesn't mean the AI algorithm in the application for a U.S. customer was wrong. It was the right algorithm, right? Does the algorithm need to be tweaked, or the bias need to be adjusted in a different set of circumstances? Possibly. But it doesn't mean the underlying algorithm was bad, though, right?
Good and bad are really subjective terms. Yeah. Now, there are two ways to kind of think about artificial intelligence. There's ways that you can train what we would call as a global model. It's something that's a universal truth.
Sure.
And they require a lot of information to train these, because you need to consider all those alternate viewpoints and all those contexts, and you train a model so that it understands and operates in that. The alternate to this is a local model where you train a model that's appropriate for you and I train a model that's appropriate for me. As we walk our AI journey, we're going to be building better tools to measure effectively those global models as well as those local models, as well as make it easier to train a model.
Does that mean the right
specific
model is
for
a
you.
hybrid model?
I would be surprised if, and in a security context, malware is malware. I don't care if the malware came from the NSA or the FSB. The mechanics of what makes malware are true. And so we trained a global model for malware.
Okay.
If I considered the same context on network traffic, your network is fundamentally different from my network. And that's where concepts like local models would start to become much more relevant. I think that the right context is going to require this. And as we consider bigger picture models of models, we're going to see use cases for both.
Okay. So when we think about, people using these models and actually implementing in the real world, there's, from a security context, let's focus on security. There's, two areas to focus on, right? There's the implementation of the security person, right? Using AI in their context. And then I think there's this additional level of a policymaker or a regulator implementing something on top of it. So what can, policymakers and security professionals learn when they try to balance innovation in using AI when they want to safeguard it against AI-enabled threats?
So there's no easy answers here.
There never are.
The truth is it's going to look a lot like what we dealt with things like GDPR.
Okay.
A lot of AI is going to be about the data. And I think we're coming to a realization that a lot of security is about the data, where it came from and where it goes. And so what we're seeing is concepts around data tagging, data sensitivity, data classification. These are going to become necessary tools. Now, I know AI hit the scene and a lot of people are rushing out to capitalize on this great new technology. Some organizations pulled way back and they said, no, we can't use any of that. I think what we're finding right now is that gray area in the middle, that the tools and capabilities to allow companies to benefit from AI, but still ensure that they have the integrity and understanding of what's.
So do you think we'll need to tag the data that's generated by AI with the fact that it's been generated by AI? Is there relevance to that? Because I think we've seen instances where, there's obviously concern over whether the data is reliable or not, right? Can we trust the data? And I think trust is the one currency that's universal. Like if you don't have trust, you don't really have anything. And so when we think about, both security and regulators looking at how their approach to it, does some of that rely on was the data generated by a human or a trusted source versus it was generated by AI? And as a result, you then have to investigate your trust of the source.
So I think that there's going to be some degree of that. And there's a subtle but very important reason for it. Not so much whether you should trust data generated from an AI, but whether another AI should train itself on data as a sort of a derived form. This sort of feedback loop has led to some really complicated and hard to root out problems where models create simplifications or as I talked about, a model that's smart in one area might be weak in another. The feedback from that weak part can be fed into another model's training concept. And so I think, yes, eventually we're going to have to get to that, probably around consumer protection laws.
Yeah, sure.
On this data was created by an AI. I think it's important for people to know the difference, but I think it's especially important for machines to know the difference.
Okay. So as we think about AI becoming increasingly intertwined with cybersecurity, how do we look at guarding against adversarial attacks where they're actually using the AI and the threat model and taking advantage of vulnerabilities either through the speed at which an AI can process, or vulnerabilities in the AI itself?
I think we're a long way away where that becomes the dominant reality, with a few exceptions. Part of it is that AI is still not where people think it is. So I don't think we're worried about it becoming a super hacker tomorrow.
Your average hacker, what we what we normally consider of that. But what about on a nation state side? Isn't that
so? Here's where I think you do have to pay attention. Concepts around phishing and social attacks.
okay?
I think AI can process and formulate much more targeted attacks in a much more effective way. In terms of how do I infiltrate a company, I don't know that AI is inherently better than much of the automated stuff that we have. In terms of help me write this piece of malware, the coding ability of AI is not that advanced. Like right now, we still have a human process that's been largely automated. If you take ransomware as a concept, their ability to generate new types of malware, to iterate it, to avoid detection, these are highly automated business-like processes. I don't think AI is going to fundamentally change that. I don't think AI is going to inherently give a weak player a significant hand up in that. No basement kid in Chicago is going to be operating on a fully stocked nation state full of 0 days. Are there going to be point spots where it's powerful and useful? 100%. But I don't think of it as this concept that AI is going to inherently change the adversarial, like the bad guy game, in the same way that AI doesn't inherently change the good guy game. It gives us access to more data. It allows us to process more data quickly. Allows us to broaden our viewpoint, so that we're thinking about things beyond the same patterns that we fall into. But the attackers have always had that same capability. The challenge is they were never as constrained. They could always move a step forward, and we had to respond to it. We're still in the same boat from a defensive perspective.
That makes sense. So do you think that there's anything specific from the criminal side that AI presents the opportunity for criminals to leverage to bypass technologies based on AI, or do you not see that, right? Like, is there a specific vulnerability or window of opportunity that is out there that we're not seeing? There's a blind spot because we're leveraging AI.
This is an interesting one because there are fewer mission critical decisions being made by AI right now. Some are influenced. A lot of what we see in AI becomes effectively decision support, where a human's still making the call, but the AI is providing and analyzing the data to do that. As we start to get to more control systems, if you imagine the OODA loop of observe, orient, decide, and act, like you end up with AI taking more of that, we'll probably find some more vulnerabilities. I think probably the closest that we've seen in real world is in the areas of like high frequency trading, where my algorithm's competing effectively against your algorithm. Now, this doesn't require AGI or generalized intelligence. These are specialized approaches, but they are probing each other's weaknesses and adapting to try to capitalize on that. We'll see some of this from an attacker perspective. The downside is we just don't put that much stuff under AI control. Now,
but that's changing, right?
10 years from now, like we could be having a different conversation.
Like I think we were in a meeting a couple months ago, and there was somebody presenting and talking about some AI threats, right? And one of the things that they related was the potential for like an AI vision right now, right? And so analyzing shapes, determining like, is something a threat? Is it an ally? And this concept of, you could have a system that would identify a tank, yet you put a simple barcode or QR code on the tank, and then that vision system is blinded to it because it's processing the data contained in the QR code or the barcode. Like that's a specific area of like, geez, we didn't think about that, right? A human would never look at that. In fact, human vision, you'd probably look at that and you might not even process the fact that there's a QR or a barcode on that tank. You're just going to identify as a tank. And it's a difference in the way AI as a vision technology works than a human vision. And so that's that's one specific way I can think about.
Yeah, like from a military perspective, target acquisition, control systems are starting to use some of this. And we'll continue to see some of that. The adversarial attacks will continue to happen. What I can say is that generally, when we find an issue in that, like responding to that is not inherently that hard. Training a new model, considering a new type of information, it's not a perfect answer, but
you just hope you find out before
AI is
it's a shooting war, right?
Now, to that point, paying attention to again, what the data in the real world is. If you're failing to kill tanks, you need to respond very quickly with updated models.
Yeah.
Like having that there will always be, to date, there will always be a human in the loop in terms of how effective is this model? Is this model better than the last one? So far, that machine decision on is this model better than the next one and the strategy on how I train that next one results in that sort of degradation effect of models training models. They don't consider that much. And so I think I don't see humans getting out of that business for a really long time for now.
Okay. So, pivoting a little bit, if I think about regulation and international cooperation, when I think about AI models, right, it really is, there's going to be some regulation needed. I mean, I hate to say that. I'm a guy who, I'm more for the free market. I'm not a big fan of the regulation, but at the same time, I think it's important to note that in some cases, this being one, we're probably going to need some regulation, right? But I also think it's interesting because, when we talk about, especially in defense terms, and we talk about cyber threats and whether you call it terrorism or not, there's going to be some international cooperation that needs to be held on this, right? I mean, otherwise you're going to have regulation that hamstrings one actor and doesn't hamstring another actor. So, do you think overall, like having additional regulation, international cooperation, does it hamstring us against our adversaries? Does it help? Like, where do you see this going from regulation and cooperation amongst nations?
There's no perfect answer there, and regulation is always an interesting one because U.S. regulation affects us, but it
doesn't affect anyone else.
Affect China.
And that was the meat of the question, right? I mean, we see this issue with China, and we see it with TikTok now, right?
There's a couple of elements that we have to concern ourselves with. One of them is, are we regulating as a concept to control the technology, or are we regulating effectively ethical controls? And I'm not averse to regulating ethical controls. There's a second part of that the technology will continue to advance. We are going to have AI haves and AI have-nots. I don't necessarily know if ethical regulations are going to inherently stop that. Funding will stop that.
Sure.
Concepts of limiting access to certain technologies, our supply chain, concepts of how do we get access to things like NVIDIA GPUs will stop or limit this. I don't think regulation in and of itself, like a blanket ban on AI, that's just bad policy.
Yeah. But what about a ban on how far you can go with AI, right? Like does look in a pop culture reference, right? If I think about the movie AI, anything else. Like there's this limit of like where does the line get crossed between sentience, in essence.
I think that that's a really deep question without a really easy answer. Whether an AI has rights or any of that kind of stuff, I'm relatively happy to punt that one down the line because I don't think we're anywhere near that. Now, whether an AI should control a system that has a direct impact of a human life,
Yeah, I think that's the closer.
I think that's a lot closer. I'm really hesitant on it, not necessarily because if you change that and said, should we use data-informed decisions on the outcome of a human life? 100%. Should an AI with its inherent strengths and weaknesses have that same? I think the answer for at least a fair amount of time until we know what they're capable of, I think the answer is going to be no, or it can inform a human but not make the call on its own. And certain degrees of regulation are going to probably have to be a little bit explicit on this.
Yeah, and I think it falls back to what I alluded to, and I think you specifically called out is the challenge is always going to be, one group, one concern, one nation making the right decision versus another nation potentially making the wrong decision. Right? It's easy for the U.S. to say we're going to limit the ability for AI to make decisional authority on a kill command versus China or any other company deciding they decided a different route, right? And we have no impact over that.
I would hope that much like we ended up with nuclear
moratorium on test bans.
I think that certain top end AI-driven weapon systems, I can see that. And when I say AI-driven, I'm not talking about target acquisition. I'm not talking about target enhancement.
Actual decisional authority.
But
yeah,
trigger pull. I could see moratoriums being proposed and, frankly, held up from an international perspective on that. If for no other reason than most people won't have and don't want to see being on the wrong side of
the receiving end,
including us. We'll have it, but we don't want to be on the wrong side of that. I suspect China doesn't want to be on the wrong side of that either.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's we got a little serious there, but it is security gets serious, right? Let's take it up a little bit of a notch here. So when I think about your role, it's a really interesting role in that you actually get to see a lot of companies out there, right? And I think I can't think of a cyber company I've heard about in the last couple of years that hasn't tried to tout it's some relevance, like their relationship to AI. Where have AI applications in cyber exceeded your expectations? And on the other side of that, where have they fallen so short?
It's interesting. So within the last year, we've talked to about 450 companies, all early stage from all over the world, and we see a lot of functional technologies that are heavily dependent on AI. Where we're seeing some really positive uptake is around data deluge type of situations. At the SOC, where we just have too much information coming in. If we start talking about like log management, where there's just too much information, we need to effectively reduce the amount of information. We're seeing some really good gains there. In areas around security application to AI use cases, we're starting to see some good gains. Again, those CISOs that are being dragged kicking and screaming into using AI within their organizations are starting to get better tools to understand, classify that data, both on the input and the output side. The risk associated with how you're going to use models. There's sometimes that we joke that some technologies get abused. We saw it for a long time with blockchain. oh, you're going to make a bus company? Well, I'm going to make a bus company with blockchain. And there was, for a while, companies are getting funded with as simple of business models as that. Right now, I've seen more than a few. We're going to do X with AI use cases. Oftentimes, they're not getting funding. Like, using AI for a legitimate reason can be a really powerful tool. I think we're at the from a VC perspective, I think we're at the mature enough standpoint that we care about the results. So it's not how the sausage is made, but more how the sausage tastes after it's made. And so, from a VC perspective, leveraging AI that gives you a competitive differentiation, great. Show it, don't tell it. When we talk to companies that have AI stories, we're asking questions around what's your data moat? Like, what data do you have that nobody else has? What's your data scientist approach to this? What unique are you bringing to it? And if there's no differentiation there, the true reality is the next person could come along and use OpenAI in exactly the same way. There's not a lot of unique value being created. And so we're looking for truly unique approaches that leverage really key understandings of the problem, where AI is just a tool in their toolkit to.
So the fundamentals aren't really much different than everything else, right? It's just how well you're implementing and what your differentiators.
Right.
Okay. So when you think about the average CISO looking at technology solutions in the cyberspace and touting AI or really anything else from that perspective, how's the average CISO cut the wheat from the chaff and figure out like where the actual meat is and where they should actually invest? Because budgets are tight for everybody.
This is one where I'll say this, and not just from an AI perspective, but all tools, results matter. Being able to show results before you buy, results as you bought, and results after you buy, that's going to be the big differentiator. Like, not just perceived results, but these are the number of attacks that we stopped. This is the reality of what those attacks would have happened. This is the number of man hours that I saved by using this tool versus not using this tool. Like, those real world measures are going to continue to be important, and the ability to be able to measure those and to consider those in your decisions are going to be increasingly a necessary part of justifying budget and getting the job done.
So if we bridge from that, and I think about, a lot of CISOs right now thinking about what's going on in the industry and the things that are really kind of top of mind, I'm sure just given the timing right now, everybody's really thinking about Change Healthcare, right? Mm-hmm. And the ransomware incident they faced. It's a really high cost that's being associated with that incident. We talked about that a little bit on the other podcast, potentially upwards of, them, Change Healthcare putting out $3.3 billion to, the companies that have been impacted from it, hopefully recouping that money. But then, the overall cost of recovering from the incident, extremely high. What's your thoughts of, I guess, ransomware in general and, maybe specifically the Change Healthcare incident that we've seen?
So this is one where I'd like to tell you, aside from change, this is an area that we have to consider. But right now, we need to really understand those high friction supply chain issues. We went through concepts around software supply chain, about where are we getting our software, who's patching it. Like, we've started to consider risk in third-party providers. We don't necessarily do a particularly good job at considering what those areas are, what a downtime in a necessary provider is. Now, there are first-order people who were probably very aware of change. They didn't account for what a change knockout would be. Throughout the entire industry and the world, really, a lot of us saw change for the very first time when this attack happened.
Yeah, it's not a name that we just know about, right?
It's that under the iceberg risk is something that we need to do a better job understanding and mitigating. Now, I would hope that this should have a lot of CISOs looking at where those critical paths are. I would hope that people who realize that there are critical paths on multiple businesses realize that they're a similar type of nexus that change represents, and do their part to protect themselves. But I think a lot of this comes down to we have to build our own resilience, and we have to start putting pressure on those that we rely on to build their own.
Yeah, it's a business level problem, right? I mean, I think for a long time we've looked at cyber, we've looked at security in general. I think security is broader than cyber, but we always seem to categorize it as cyber. We've looked at it as a technical problem, right, and it's really not a technical problem, right? It's a business problem, it's a business risk, but we tend not to. Like, a lot of people get caught in the technical legacy of not talking about it in business language, which then makes it harder to see the very large problem under the surface.
We can get very tied up in this attack or that nation state, or like this is the buzz today, where we have to remember that at the end of the day, we're doing resilience for business processes, and what breaking one of those business processes means to our companies has to be an integral part of this conversation. Security is not a sunk cost. It's an actual cost of doing business. It's part of that honoring the integrity of your process, that resilience, so that your partners can rely on you, and that your customers can rely on you, your stakeholders can rely on you.
And I think if you're a CISO and you want a bigger seat at the table, like, make yourself part of the business 100%. To earn that seat, right?
I like to think that we're past the idea that InfoSec is telling people no. Like, we are business enablers, but we have to be integrated into the business, not just enabling, but alignment, so that we're doing the right things for the right reasons for the business.
So, tailored to your operating role right now and what you're doing, what's an area where, you look out in the space and you say, I don't see a startup that's focusing on this void. Like, is there a void? Is there an area, a hole that you see, a missed spot where you wish somebody would pitch you on something?
In talking to so many companies, I get a very broad space. There are areas that I think are still pretty unsolved.
Okay.
One of the areas that we're always kind of looking at is around identity. I don't think that problem has been close to solved, particularly the
You think that would be a fundamental thing, right?
So one of the challenges is, I think a lot of people went a long way thinking about identity as you or me, and human identity is important. And I think we've spent a lot of time thinking about it. The problem is now, let's use AI as an example. Yeah. Like, what's AI's identity? What is the identity of automated business processes? What's the identity of that back-end report correlation between your accounting software and Salesforce? There's a lot of non-human identity out there that really needs to be continued to grow upon. That's an area that we're definitely looking at right now.
Yeah, that's really good feedback. There you have it. If you're looking for a startup, identity and how to answer the non-human identity question, so that's good. So do you think, hopefully when do you think we'll see a corporate board actually brought to task by its investors for failing to take security seriously? Like, we've seen SolarWinds, we've seen Change Healthcare, there are countless numbers to look at. Like, we don't really see the impact, right? Like,
we're increasingly coming to that spot now. So far, it hasn't necessarily been the board. With every one of these, there's class action lawsuits and stuff.
Sure.
that the indemnification will cover the board. They're not personally on the hook, but the value of the asset will come down.
They've got responsibility though, right? Like at a high.
There's fiduciary responsibility. Where we're going to start seeing this is some of the changes in the SEC, and I think I think that's a really fraught area right now on how they're choosing who to go after and who not to go after. But as they approach this, that concept of appropriate risk management, and that's really where we're going to start finding people realizing that it's not just an inside problem. It can very much and very quickly become an outside problem, and with regulators like the SEC involved, it can become not just a perceptive outside problem, the one that we've had forever in terms of risk of brand damage or diminishing goodwill, to a really potentially criminal outcome.
I was surprised that the SEC didn't go as far as saying that they needed they needed to have someone who had specific level of expertise on the board, right?
I don't think we're there yet, but I think that directionally they're starting to look in that direction. And I think planning to get in front of that, like where information security becomes a real material risk, and much like insurance risk, much like concept of HR, where you have board level concepts of risks and risk management, information security is definitely walking that path where the type of people that are looking at it and considering it in the calculus are going to start requiring board level understanding.
So, when we think about investment at the corporate level on a security side, kind of my wrap up question here for you is, where do you think right now that CISOs are actually wasting budget? What are they putting money into that just isn't giving them the payback, and they should divert that into some other area? And if you have an answer on where you think they should focus it,
yeah. No two organizations are the same. And
sure.
I will say that most organizations could do with non-sexy blocking and tackling investment.
Hygiene.
Yeah, like the flip side is what they're not doing right now, or what they're spending on that they don't need.
Don't say
it's
AI.
Hard. No, it's hard to say. There's a lot of technologies that have been very historically valuable and have a better than zero control value, but are diminishing in their value through shifts to the cloud, through shifts in underlying technology. And so I'll throw out, I'm hoping most people don't have it, but IDS as a technology that went from exceptional relevance and prominence to sort of an afterthought. Now, looking for spends on some of these legacy technologies and looking at what their more modern equivalencies, I think we'll start to free up some degree of that budget. Now, not everybody can give up their legacy stuff, so there's no one size fits all for everybody here, but along those lines, and a lot of looking at what precepts we held a decade ago and how many of those precepts are still true, I think you'll find that there's a fair chunk of legacy spend to consider reduction over time.
Yeah, I think that's insightful. I don't think enough CISOs go through their budget and look at like what is the legacy spend that's not paying off for them. And I call it, we talked about it before, the shiny ball, right? Like chasing the sexy because it's cool and new, versus really double down on the hygiene and make sure that you've got a good plan in place.
You end up with a lot of accrued spend over time, and once a program's in play, it has a life of its own.
Hard to extract.
Like you have to look at, was that even what if you don't want to consider, was that the right spend at the time? Is it the right spend still?
Yeah. Well, with that, Ryan, I really want to thank you for being on this episode of Security Gets Serious. It's been a great session, really insightful, a lot of good discussion. I'd like to thank everybody else for watching. Join us next time on the next episode, and tune in for Security Gets Serious. I'm your host, Ben Carr.
Thanks.